Hello, everyone. I'm Arturo Franco, Head of Research for the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. Welcome to day 2 of the Equity Imperative, Building Sustainable and Inclusive Economic Systems. We kicked off yesterday with an engaging discussion around the promise of inclusive growth. How can we reimagine our economies to make sure that everyone shares the benefits of growth? Today, we will dive deeper into questions of equity and economic opportunity as they relate to technological innovation, industrial development, and high-quality jobs. It is my pleasure to first introduce Laura Tyson, distinguished professor at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley and former chair of the US President's Council of Economic Advisors during the Clinton administration. Welcome, Laura, and thank you for the early wake up in California.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Arturo. And it's fine in California. It is early, but it is a wonderful panel. Happy to be there.
Great, thank you. Let's begin focusing on the US and perhaps taking a long view. For more than a decade, during the longest economic expansion in modern history, you have been reminding folks that globalization and technological change have caused dramatic shifts in the structure of the American labor market. Today, we know, for example, that the chances of children earning more than their parents is about 50%, down from about 90% in the 1940s and 50s. So what trends have you been following around wages and employment? And the topic we're talking about here, wealth and income inequality, and how do you make sense of what's happened in the last few decades?
Well, thank you, Arturo. It's interesting. You mentioned the Council of Economic Advisors. That was way back in the 1990s. But by the end of the 1990s, I would say already, and the data now show this clearly, we were concerned about increasing inequality, increasing wage inequality. Wage inequality is really important here because most income is generated through wages. And so when we think about income inequality, oftentimes we talk about capital income. Well, there is the issue of capital income versus labor income, but we were worried about wage inequality. And by the way, Bob Lawrence will know that one of the things in wage inequality was where the strong wage growth tended to be in manufacturing, in the export intensive sectors of the economy. So just by way of saying these are not new issues, what we began to see then, and clearly has been happening really for the last 30 years at least, is what's called the polarization of employment, and to a lesser extent wages, the hollowing out of the middle, particularly through manufacturing, because that's where a lot of the middle was. So as employment in manufacturing declined as a share of total employment, you could see that hollowing out. Some other things you saw is wage stagnation for middle and low wage workers, a growing premium between the high-skilled, high-wage workers and everybody else. So there's the wage inequality, decoupling of wage growth and productivity growth. So wages were not keeping up with productivity. Productivity was actually disappointing. It was disappointing, but it was still stronger than wage growth. And then a decline in labor's share of value added, that capital versus income. All of those trends were developing, and we saw them developing over 30 years or more. Now, I'm focusing here mainly on the advanced industrial countries because those are the countries that my research has been the focus of. I want to say right away before we continue that there have been differences among the advanced industrial countries, that in fact the US has on most of these measures been an outlier. It is not done relatively well, it's done relatively poorly. No other country of the advanced industrial country has had the same degree of increase in inequality. No other country has the same degree of severe stagnation for rank and file workers, say below in the lower to middle income level. And so we need to recognize that we're going to talk about technology as a force behind these trends. We're going to talk about globalization as a force behind these trends. But there are choices, there are policy choices that can either exacerbate the trends or ameliorate the trends. And if you look at a competitive large economy like Germany, which I've spent some time looking at over the past couple of years, Germany's done better. Germany has done better. Why? Canada's done better. Why? Because of policy choices and institutions. So let me just start there as a framing.
Yeah, and I would love to go deeper. I know that you have spent time in Germany recently, looking at the issue of job polarization there, and it's, as you say, perhaps more attenuated than in the U.S. You've also been selected as a member of the President of France, President Macron's Major Future Economic Challenges Commission that is looking, amongst other things, at inequality and how to deal with it in France. What lessons do you draw from those two countries or other advanced economies, not just of what they did better in the past, because that's gone, but what are they doing today to prepare for the future?
So let me start with Germany, where I think, and again, it's very interesting to go back in time. When I was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors back in the 90s, we were already talking about the strengths of the German training system, the German apprenticeship system, the ability of Germany to maintain more manufacturing employment as productivity increased. Maybe that had to do with the training and apprenticeship programs. Maybe that had to do with the incentives of the companies to invest more in technology that works with labor rather than technology that substitutes for labor. So I want to say that, and there you may have the importance of unions and collective voice. So when you make a decision to automate and how much to automate and how much to displace your labor versus how to should you skill your labor, the voice of labor is important here. So Germany, apprentice systems, labor voice. Another thing really interesting about Germany, now fast forwarding to the 2000s, this seemed to be working pretty better in the middle and upper wage levels than in the lower wage levels in Germany, not a surprise. And therefore, Germany introduced, breaking rank with its own long tradition, a federally enforced minimum wage. And that really had an effect. If you look at wage inequality after the introduction of that minimum wage, you can see that the wage inequality compresses. So those are some examples. When we met with the Macron Commission, we talked about all of those issues. And I think I want to bring into this conversation a very important distinction that Danny Roderick made. He was part of that conversation, the commission, between policies that occur pre-production, policies that can affect production itself, and policies that occur after production. So oftentimes these are called pre-distribution policies and post-distribution policies, but we've come to call them production. Pre-distribution policies, that's where you'd have education and training. That's where you'd have, okay, you've got to give the workforce the skills, and by the way, the upskilling and reskilling over time possibilities as the technology changes, as the jobs change. So education, really important. In the post-production stage, I would say that's really where you're talking about social insurance, unemployment insurance, and the benefits that are associated with a worker as they move perhaps into unemployment and then out of unemployment into another job. So social insurance system, very, very important. We talked about those in France. So we talked about all of these on the Macron Commission too. So and then the production phase would be the minimum wage that I mentioned. Any labor regulations, any worker representation, unions, worker voice. And then the very controversial issues, and we can discuss this, of is there anything the governments can do to through industrial policy or regional development policy or research and development policy to directly encourage the creation of good jobs? Is there any, infrastructure investment is kind of one of those that would fall there. You could create good jobs by investing in the infrastructure, which supports good jobs. So we did discuss all of those things in the Macron Commission. Mm-hmm.
Great, and that's great that you bring it here. We were listening from Bob Lawrence, Marcela Escobari, and then Breznitz later. Marcela has been doing great work on exactly that bottom that you said Germany has not been able to solve for, or except for raising the minimum wage. I have a question that comes out of conversations we've had with you as an advisor and a fellow of the Center for Inclusive Growth. You've many times pointed out the difference, and this might be what Danny Roderick is calling pre-distribution, between focusing on inequality of outcomes, income inequality or wealth inequality, and what you call inequality of opportunity. You've been an advocate for gender equality in the workforce, for the gains that independent workers or previously excluded groups have been making in the workforce. There's research that points to great losses during the pandemic of all of those groups that have been gaining representation in the workforce, perhaps of even as much as a generation. So what are some of the dark clouds that you see in the horizon in terms of the labor market, and how are you thinking about how governments, we've got people from all over the world in the call today, how governments, how civil society, and how businesses can best meet the moment that we're living today?
Okay. So first of all, I want to emphasize in the previous discussion a word I didn't use, or area I didn't use, that I think is really important, and it's important for all societies, and that is the provision of health. And it gets to this final question, but think about health in pre-distribution as basically the ability of someone to become educated and to take a job and to be in the workforce is going to depend upon their health and their access to health support. Okay, once they're in the workforce, after they retire from the workforce, health provision is absolutely critical as a factor factor to what happens to all citizens. And here we're talking about workers, or I'm talking about workers, but workers. So let me just add that, because it gets to the care issue very quickly. I also worked in the past several years. I've worked on gender equality issues for a long time. World Economic Forum was where I got started on this. One of the things I did for I think it was 2017, was a report for the UN, how to accelerate achievement of SDG 5, which is women's equality and empowerment. And when we looked at that question, the key issue around the world, independent of development level, okay, is the fact that women disproportionately handle the care responsibilities of their households, of their children, of their parents, of the household itself. And that is a huge burden that needs to be better shared. And what happened here in COVID was so many women left the workforce because they had to. The care system collapsed, the schooling system collapsed. Someone had to be the care provider. And the way that societies organize themselves, that tended to fall disproportionately on women. So I think going forward, we have to think more, certainly in the US, but I think around the world. How do we provide this kind of support for care? In McKinsey Global Institute, we talk about how do you marketize that? How do you make care giving a serious profession, a profession that has a reasonable income, a good job? How do you do that? Because we need more of those jobs. So let me say that's a key lesson that came from all of this. The second thing is, even the US during the pandemic introduced unemployment insurance for gig workers, for the workers who are working through platforms, who do not have standard employment contracts. That part of the workforce is not that large yet. It's maybe 1 to 3%, but it is larger than the official numbers show, because a lot of independent contractors show up there. They don't show up as gig workers. Anyway, it's a fairly substantial and growing part of the workforce. We gave some temporary unemployment insurance, but it's over now. Okay. Other countries are actually working hard to figure out, okay, how do we, if more and more people are going to be working through these platforms, and they don't have a contract with their employer, how do we get them? How do we protect their legal rights? How do we protect their access to social benefits? A really interesting thing happened in the past few months. The UK a couple of years ago introduced a new concept called a worker. A worker is not the same as an employee. It's not the same as an independent contractor. It's a worker. And the worker has certain rights, not all the rights, but certain rights that an employee has. Minimum wage is one of them. Disability, access to disability insurance is another. Legal protections is another. So whoever is employing you cannot discriminate against you on gender. In a recent case, the Supreme Court in the UK upheld that and said to Uber, your employees are all workers, and sorry, you have to provide all of those rights to them. They are protected under the law. So that is I think more of that kind of thing is going to happen. In Germany, they are actually having now a number of the gig workers are working together with the big unions to become part of a collective voice that would insist on the rights of those workers. So those are some examples.
Those are great examples. We are also seeing things in France, for example, which go beyond just the basic social kind of welfare benefits, making those portable, but into skilling benefits with this kind of annual learning account that
annual learning account, very important.
And we will go there. I just wanted to make a comment. Yesterday when we kicked off this event, Mike Froman talked about our framework Built for All, which many of you participated in putting together. One of the tenets of that is that if we want a more inclusive economy, we need to measure different things. And going to your point about women and caretakers, one of my favorite quotes from Mariana Mazzucato is, if a single parent marries their nanny, GDP actually goes down. So we need to make sure that we measure what is valuable. Laura, stick around with us. I'd like to just introduce the three panelists that have joined us. Marcela Escobari, who is joining us from DC, Senior Fellow at Brookings, leading the Workforce of the Future initiative there. Great to have you, Marcela. Dan Breznitz, University Professor and Chair of the Innovation Policy Lab at the University of Toronto's Munk School. Dan, I think you're joining us today not from Canada, but from Poland, where you are presenting your book, Innovation in Real Places, Strategies for Prosperity in an Unforgiving World, a dramatic name. And Robert Lawrence, Professor of International Trade and Investment at the Harvard Kennedy School, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute, and another close advisor to the center. Welcome, all of you. Let me start with you, Professor Lawrence. I think Laura alluded to this. When we are asked for examples of what shared prosperity means, or episodes in the world of what you would call inclusive growth, some analysts would point to the golden age of U.S. manufacturing. We just heard how that story ended, but you've posed a question in an upcoming book called Behind the Curve, and perhaps the question is more relevant for other countries represented in the audience. If we can still consider manufacturing as a potential driver of inclusive prosperity, can another country in the world have the golden age of manufacturing that the U.S. had? Can you elaborate a little bit on that and what you mean by premature deindustrialization?
Well, thank you very much, Arturo. It's a pleasure to be here and to follow Laura. Yes, Traditionally, manufacturing was an escalator. It allowed for both in developed and developing countries. It allowed for people who were not highly educated to obtain skills and to enter the middle class. In a sense, these middle income jobs, which Laura was referring to, were a characteristic of manufacturing. And over time, technology has tended to displace those. So for that reason, the structure of manufacturing is changing. In addition, what we find, and this goes to this issue of premature deindustrialization, although it's also true of industrial countries as well, and that is, if you emerge later, it has become increasingly more difficult to achieve the same share of manufacturing employment as today's advanced countries were able to achieve. So that Great Britain had its manufacturing share peak at about 35% of its total labor force. The United States, around 25%. China, the dynamo of manufacturing in our economy recently, peaked around 2013 with an average of about 19%. So the question then is, what's happened that makes it more difficult for late emerging economies to achieve these peaks? And I believe there are three factors, two of which people would commonly refer to. One is productivity has grown rapidly, and it tends to diffuse more rapidly in manufacturing. So that today's developing countries, the good news is they have access to superior technologies than the, say, United Kingdom had when it was at a similar level of per capita income. So they can meet the demands of low-income countries with fewer workers. So that's the role of technology. There's a second effect for some countries. I find it surprisingly less important, and that has to do with their trade performance. Many countries today that we think of as strong exporting nations, like Korea or like Singapore, are experiencing significant declines in the share of manufacturing employment. China, as I indicated earlier, has peaked. In China, the share of manufacturing has been declining for about 5 or 6 years as the structure of their economy has changed. And this has implications, interestingly, in China, for women in particular. In the United States, it was the men who didn't have high skills that seemed to have been adversely affected. In China, it's typically women who were working in factories that have now migrated from China in industries like clothing and labor-intensive industries, electronics, who have borne the brunt of this decline in manufacturing employment. So underlying structural change is significant. But then there's a third factor that no one really talks about that much. And that has to do with the patterns of demand in countries. Investment is a very important source, of course, of the demand for equipment. And over time, what we've seen is, particularly in Latin America, investment rates have declined. And therefore, the demand for manufacturing workers has declined. There's a second dimension to this, which is that today, more and more investment takes the form of intangible capital, basically software, databases, intellectual branding, corporate know-how. All of these are increasingly more significant, and they tend to be more skill-intensive activities. And so all of these trends of technology are moving against people who don't have adequate education. And that's why I think training people to be part of the digital economy is so critical and increasingly critical in today's modern economy. Now, developing countries have benefited from digital technologies on the one hand, in the sense that they've been able to leapfrog using telephones for payment systems and so on. So there are potential. I think e-commerce is tremendously important for small and medium-sized enterprises. And so promoting that is critical. The real question is, are we going to be able to see countries become services exporters because of innovation in information technology? Thus far, we haven't developed that avenue sufficiently. I think this is also true in developed countries, where we've seen a lot of regional inequality. But one of the byproducts of Zoom has been to, in a sense, initiate a tremendously positive shock, in my view, in that we have a coordinated way to communicate. What we're participating in now, this event, is simply a manifestation of that. Well, what it means is you don't have to be in the same place as you work. And that has major implications. It means that some of the depressed outlying areas in the United States, and indeed some of the developing countries, now have the ability to participate directly in remote work. There are regulatory constraints, there are technological constraints, but I believe that this can offer a major avenue for a lot of depressed areas now to develop tradables in a non-traditional fashion. And if you can attract, and this will be the last thing I say, if you can attract skilled workers, educated workers, to enjoy the benefits of your community where housing is cheaper, where there are, if you can attract them with amenities, yes, a lot of what they buy will be imported into your town or city, but they will spend locally. And so those people will create jobs for relatively less skilled workers. They will eat in restaurants. They will require a whole lot of non-traded services. So I believe that this is a new opportunity being brought upon us by COVID. And I also think that for developing countries, the ability to provide these kinds of services remotely is an avenue that is underdeveloped. It's constrained often by regulations, but we need to have those regulations relaxed in order to allow for these opportunities to be taken advantage of.
Thank you, Professor Lawrence. And to that point, we have been having conversations with economists in Europe because the EU regulation of remote work, which they still call telework because it's from the 1970s, is a good place to start. You did my job as a moderator because the question you posed about innovation is exactly what I wanted to turn to Dan Breznitz based not just on the book that he's written, but his experience working in Israel and Canada, now appointed by the finance minister to look at innovation in Canada. Dan, to me, the answer to the question about manufacturing is no, from Robert Lawrence. Is innovation the next big promise for a more inclusive economy? And how do we make it more better distributed than what we've seen so far in the Silicon Valley type of model? And you might be muted.
Yes, I started talking and then immediately realized that it's a common Zoom mistake. I just been for the first time in a real conference, and I lost all my Zoom abilities. More seriously, I think we shouldn't first, before we think about innovation and whether it's a big promise, I think we need to actually talk about what innovation is, why and how it creates economic growth and prosperity, and where. So first of all, since you mentioned Silicon Valley, we have to remember that innovation is not invention. It is not just coming up with a great idea for the first time. Innovation is the actualization of ideas. It can be, and it should be in the first stage, right? First to the world, but it also should be in every and each stage of production of both goods and services, from making them better, from actually figuring out to produce them. I don't know if any one of you tried to buy a car lately in the United States, but we can't buy cars in the United States because we no longer know how to produce semiconductors. Only the Taiwanese still remember how to do that. And we can see it by the way COVID, and we talk about inequalities. It's really nice to invent mRNA molecule that works, but in order for that to actually transform the Earth, we have to innovate on production. So we will actually produce it into the tunes of several billions units, probably looking at what happened with Pfizer and Moderna every 6 or 7 months. We have to figure out the vials and how to distribute it. We have to, how we maintain it. We have to innovate all across, and we have to continuously do that. And it's important to remember that because most of economic welfare that actually help people is because of all of those stages and the continuity of innovation, not because somebody came with a great idea. And instead, we are completely obsessed on stage one, partly because Silicon Valley has a massive PR machine, partly because it sells a lot of newspaper to talk about another IPO or M&A. And we forgot what innovation is all about. We also forgot that because of globalization and the fragmentation of production, Silicon Valley actually create, and its equivalent, I've been to Tel Aviv, I was born in Israel, create massive inequalities. And the reason is that innovation in that stage, the first stage of innovation, creates a positive spillover only when it moves to the other stages, production, improvement, assembly. Those stages no longer happen where you have that first stage of innovation. So what I would argue that if we want innovation to be a promise for other countries, and by the way, for other regions in the United States, we have to remind ourselves what is innovation and then figure out what kind of institutions we need and look at other cases. I mentioned Taiwan. We can mention also region in Italy in the fashion industry. We can also look at Shenzhen in China. We can look at India if you want to talk about the back offices and services. What do you need to excel in different stages? And then also ask ourselves, do we really want the whole world to look like Silicon Valley? Because I don't think most places can be Silicon Valley, but also, do we really want that massive inequality in all places on Earth? Instead, what I think we should encourage and help places, that's why it's called innovation in real places, is to figure out where, in what stage and in what industry, and where I talk about industry, I also talk about services, they can excel, and how to develop the institution that allows them to excel and sustain that success over time in those stages. And I'll be happy to talk about it more later.
Great. And we're going to have a great back and forth. I know, Laura, you might want to jump on it, because the last time I checked, Silicon Valley is not just still a real place, but it's a place in California. And Laura, you're part of the California Council of Economic Advisors. So I'll let you go, and then I'll come back to Marcela.
Okay, I just want to do one question to put on the table for Dan in the discussion. So because I noted that every example he used about countries developing capabilities or expertise was what I would call a kind of focused, almost industrial policy. You know, the semiconductor industry out of Taiwan did not grow out of pure market forces, and but everyone you mentioned actually had. We in the U.S. we have tremendous incentives to innovate in stage one. We have research and development. We have tax credit. We have all of that finance through all of the incentives and tax treatment of private equity. We put a huge amount into stage one, policy-wise. We don't put much anyplace else. And by the way, the production of drugs, to me, in the United States shows an important thing. It not only was the research and development, the reason that happened is because the government said, we'll buy it all. We're taking away any production risk at all. Okay, we're ready. Okay, so procurement, the government as providing incentives for the rest of the stages of innovation. I just want to link to that in our conversation. That's all. And I felt like I wanted to do that right away before we lost that trend.
No, and Laura, that's a great point, and I think it connects. I mean, back to your long look at history and the trends that you saw in the U.S. Some parts of the U.S. were able, given the capacity of their governments or vision, or just the way their innovation ecosystem, as Dan is describing it, worked, to make those transitions. And some parts of the U.S. just saw manufacturing go away, like Rob Lawrence was describing, and nothing come back. And that's been the focus of Marcela Escobari's work at Brookings. Marcela, you've been looking at what's happened in the past and what's happening today to low-income workers. You've been focusing on job transitions and job mobility, stagnating wages and the shrinking middle class in real places, then in specific cities and states in the US. And in your report, Moving Up, you came up with this concept of low-wage sandpits. Can you tell us a little bit more about what those are and how they affect the upward mobility of workers in the US?
Sure. Thank you, Arturo. And it's really great to join this panel and these great thinkers. And actually, just like Professor Tyson, Lawrence, and Breznitz referred to, it is the shift of what countries produce and how efficiently they do it that determine the jobs and careers available for workers, right? And the trend, as you've mentioned, is around this two-tier service economy. Top tier companies employ highly skilled and educated workers to create and export digital services around the world. And these workers generate demand in local services, barbers, and ice cream shops, which less skilled workers in the second tier provide. I hope that what Robert mentioned around remote work can lead to a shift and convergence. But right now, what we see is actually that the cities with most complex industries also tend to have the largest proportion of low-wage workers. So complexity, which we want, and growth, which we want, also brings inequality, right? So there's another facet of this cohort of low-wage workers that Arturo mentioned, which is low-wage work has become increasingly sticky, right? Our analysis shows that over a 10-year period, only 43% of workers in low-wage occupations leave low-wage work. But that tends to decrease exponentially through time. So an average worker, a dishwasher, has 13% chance to leave low-wage work on year 1. And on year 10, he has 1% chance to leave low-wage work. So we see the reason of this is what we've been discussing, kind of like the structure of the labor market, where when we're looking at the workers' occupational transitions, and we've been looking at this through the last 20 years where we can get data, is that it's not just that middle wage occupations have been declining, which has been well documented, but specifically stepping stone occupations, like those that historically served as conduits between the low and the high wage. They are shrinking. They're becoming a smaller part of the labor force. So we see what Arturo's talking about, these what we call sandpit clusters, right? Groups of low-wage occupations that people churn within and rarely escape. And as a result, we're just grappling not just with inequality, but also this real feeling that many have that the upper tier is just unattainable. And it's reflected in the statistic that Arturo shared at the beginning of this panel. And particularly in the US, where the belief in the chance to move up is so baked into our national ethos, these trends have people have left people feeling hopeless, right? Like they're stuck in this pit of sand that any direction that they turn, climbing out of it is difficult, and what we found, unlikely. So we need growth, but if we want to drive inclusive growth, I think we have to be very purposeful, and we're looking at not only the need for some of the policies that Laura spoke about, but being able to get even more granular on where people are getting stuck and how to help them get unlocked.
Great, Marcela. We're getting great questions from around the world about Asia, which we can touch on, about trade, Bob, and if we get to a world of service exporters, who's going to be doing the manufacturing, and about innovation for Dan. But let me just push a little bit more on the idea of low-wage workers feeling stuck, because I think that's a feeling that a lot of people can relate to from around the world, but for very different reasons, right? That when I think about my country, Mexico, a lot of people are stuck, but they're stuck in the informality. They're stuck in outside of the market. You're talking about people who are formally employed and are feeling stuck. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, my background, 20 years of my career has been in international development and seeing many of these problems. And part of the shock is seeing how that precariousness and that we've seen in informality is now a facet of the American labor force too. But I do think that understanding what's happening can help us be very actionable on how to get people unstuck. These sandpit clusters that we talk about, right? In a way, they come from the service economy. They make up around 30% of jobs. There are 38 million people, right? Personal appearance, cleaning, food service, and all of these are growing, COVID-19 notwithstanding. And workers are 4 times as likely to transition within these clusters and occupations than outside in clusters that are much higher wage, right? And it makes a difference. Like think about our 4th cluster is in production and transportations. This is a cluster that's going to see a lot of change. Something's growing, something's shrinking. Half of the occupations in that cluster are growing. Packagers, drivers, and some are decreasing. So people have where to move, even if they're going to be in this, stuck. And the here firms have a lot that they can do at helping people jump clusters in a way. But when you think about a cluster that I think is very pertinent to the discussion on manufacturing, and I think is going to affect the rest of the world based on what Robert was talking about, our 5th cluster is assemblers and machine operators, right? It's like 4 million people. 21 out of the 26 occupations are shrinking, right? So these are workers that have no out in the structure of our labor force. So it's no surprise that we have seen folks dropping out of the labor force. We are at the lowest labor participation rates. COVID has even lowered that by 2%. So we can be very specific at saying these workers, what are the things they can do that get them to jump out, right? Construction, plumbers, etc. So anyway, I think the problem of low-wage work is daunting, but I think precise data and analysis can help us narrow where policies can affect workers who need it the most and when.
Yeah, and I love your emphasis on rebuilding the ladder, right? We lost the middle of the ladder, and we need those steps to come back. Bob, I'm turning to you, and I want to just add an extra angle, an extra villain in the story that you are very well equipped to talk about, which is trade, international trade and globalization, blamed for, in many cases, the hollowing out of jobs in many parts of the world. You can respond to Marcela, but also tell us about the prospects of doing anything in the world of trade that could create more inclusive growth.
Well, yes. I think in terms of assigning responsibilities, one has to make a distinction between sort of the aggregate structural changes in the economy and particular shocks which have disturbed local communities and indeed workers, inflicted real pain on places and on workers. We find, I mean, there's research that suggests workers who lose their job in manufacturing for trade or other reasons, lose 1.5 times their annual income. So displacement is extremely costly. Nonetheless, as I said, in the aggregate, the famous paper on the China shock, for instance, estimated that 1 million jobs were lost due to imports into the United States coming from China. Well, the total number of jobs lost over that period was closer to 6 million. So that just gives you an idea of the aggregate numbers. That doesn't mean to say that there wasn't a lot of dislocation. Here I want to come in on what Laura mentioned, which related to this emphasis on technological development in the United States and elsewhere, and an underemphasis on adjustment policies and an underspending on helping in active labor market policies for those who are dislocated. If we think, for instance, they're trying to sell the transition to electric vehicles, for instance, as a wonderful jobs creator. But if you just think about the mechanics of moving from a combustion engine to an electric engine, you'll start to realize we're going to do away with a huge number of parts makers. The whole supply chain is going to have to change. And that's going to mean we're no longer making pistons, we're no longer making axles. All those people whose jobs depend on that are going to find them disappearing. And we're going to replace it with an electric vehicle. It'll be good for the climate, perhaps, if we have the right kind of power sources. But for the people, we need far more active labor market policies. And here I just finally want to add to what Marcela has said. It's a paradox because in our economy today, firms are complaining about a shortage of skills. And I think it's partly because firms are excessively impressed by formal educational qualifications where they are not necessary. It turns out that you can do courses that can equip you to get into the kind of jobs that have ladders, as opposed to bogging you down in the sandpit. Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all have huge programs which allow at very low cost for people located all over the world to become credentialed in skills which are being demanded in information technology. And they can use these to signal to employers that even though they may not have gone to college or university, they have the requisite skills to fill those jobs. And those are the jobs which new studies at Yale and a brilliant study by McKinsey, who have looked at the experience of 4 million workers, have traced can lead, despite not having a formal education, to a ladder which allows you to climb up again into the middle class. So those are the ones we need to point people to. Those are the kinds of systems we need to develop that people can signal to employers actually they have the skills, and then we need to change the mindsets of the employers. And I think nothing will change their mindsets like the current scarcity of workers.
Yeah.
That's the best driver of which allows for the acceleration of people beyond where they used to be employed.
And exactly a combination of this ability to work remotely with upskilling that doesn't have to happen inside of a plant or a company, and new industries could hopefully start creating solutions for low-income workers. I wanna just give Dan a chance to respond to the question. The other example, Professor Lawrence, that came up in the car industry, which kind of is bad news for one of the sectors that Marcela was talking about, is driverless cars, right? And driverless cars could come in without any adjustment policies, and a lot of people will lose their jobs. So Dan, innovation in real places, Laura's question is, with or without government incentives. Can we have inclusive innovation in all places?
So I will put it differently. There is no place that is successful in any of the cases that I have seen without some kind of public policy. The reason I don't want to say government is because many times when the national government in those places do not do their job, it is the regional, the local government that does. And that's also one thing that I wanted to do in my book, unlike the others where I follows actually Professor Tyson's argument in her earlier books and look mostly at nations. That leads us, and I think that's critical for the answer to your second question. We need to figure out what does it mean to have what I called innovation policy. You can call it a subset of industrial policy. I might disagree, but still, when you're not the prime minister or a president, but instead either you're a mayor or a provincial leader, or actually business leaders that want to arrange the region and have public policy, because the leverage that you have, what you can do and cannot do, are completely different. You're much more limited on some impacts and might be actually much more flexible on others. So for example, to Rob's argument about skills, you have basically described exactly what North Carolina has done with biotech manufacturing. In the beginning, when they decided to go for biotech manufacturing, one of the things they did, and it's a dual thing that they did, is they created the reverse program, but then they went to all those companies and says, we are doing this program. We want your HR department to agree that if you finish that program, you're going to treat those people as if they have the equivalent of a BA or an MA, so you can actually accept them to your company. And it worked perfectly for several years, right? We always, especially in the US and especially in certain states, have somewhat less than optimal politics, but it has been working well for the last 20 years.
Great. So I'm going to thank you, Dan. That's very useful, and it's not just relevant for the US. I think the regional approaches to development are relevant in many countries. And this conference is called the Equity Imperative because we have seen cities in the US and in other parts of the world, like Atlanta, for example, creating what they call equity plans. It's a new kind of form of organization. Laura, when you look at California, we've taken you to France and Germany and other countries, but when you come back home and you look at the economy and the imperative of inclusive growth, which I think you believe in, what do you recommend the governor? How do we achieve inclusive California?
So California, I mean, this is a very tough issue for California. California has the greatest level of, I think, income and wealth inequality of any state in the United States. Okay. It is also a highly innovative state. Certainly in stage one, it is a center of innovation. It trains through its public university system and its very rich community college system. And I mean rich meaning in terms of offerings, a significant part of a skilled workforce. But it has still, look, leisure and hospitality and retail sales are very important parts of the state of California. So is manufacturing products. But think about where those low-wage workers are, and think of where COVID hit, and think of the fact that those were mostly female workers anyway and low-skilled workers. They were in those sectors. And it is hard. It is hard to see how training by itself or innovation from stage one onward can handle that part of the economy. So I want to say that one thing that I believe is we need to keep saying, we may not be able to make all low wage jobs good jobs, but we can make them good jobs or livelihoods by essentially a set of government policies that make sure they are, so that those low wage jobs have a livable minimum wage. They have earned income tax credits which increase the after-tax income of that coming from that, access to healthcare, access to good education for their children, which is a key issue here, thinking generationally, thinking about the odds of success going forward. Not only are these low-wage workers around the world sort of stuck in terms of their own careers, but because of the quality of the education and care and opportunities for their children, those children are stuck too. So I sometimes think we just need to add to our discussion here that there are a number of things, maybe you call them pre-distribution, maybe you call them post-distribution, maybe you call them in the middle, minimum wage support, things that can be done to take what will be by nature a low wage job and make it a good job for the person who will have it.
But
Right.
Laura, I think that makes it a good job, right? Living wage, even
Yes, but I'm saying, yes, so Marcela, I agree, Marcela, and what I'm saying is I'm not sure that we can depend upon the market system to generate those jobs. What I am saying is that all of those dimensions of making the job good are dimensions of policy choice to make the job good from the point of view of the life of the worker and his or her family. So
Laura, that being said, and I completely agree with your point, by the way, there was an article in The Economist this week which basically says we've never had better jobs and describes the jobs in the industrial
I saw that.
revolution era. I thought it was appalling, but we always need better conditions for workers. We can't compare ourselves to the ancient past. But to Marcela's point and to your point, I think there's a wide range of offerings from the private sector. There's companies that take really good care of workers, including independent and gig workers, and others that just do what it's minimally required. So I'm going to go to Marcela with a question and Dan to finish. Very quickly, what is the role of the private sector and business?
I want one thing to put on the table.
Sure.
So Laura remind me that as a political economist, I should talk about government. There's a very strong correlation with companies that care about their workers and the kind of government they have, regulation and laws that enforce those companies.
Okay.
Now shut up.
That correlation being proven, or that hypothesis being proven, Marcela, what can businesses do even beyond that?
No, to reinforce a little bit Laura and Dan's point, at the minimum, we know that as the market, as many companies end up outsourcing their low wage work, it's very hard to look at all spectrums of companies and what they're doing. So at the lower end, at the end of the day, knowing that dishwasher will be stuck in that job, it even creates more of an imperative to say, can we get the minimum wages and protections so that person can participate fully in American society, right? That's I think part of the equation. On the how to move and still help the society not become continuously bifurcated, I do think firms have a role to play, obviously, since they're the ones who employ people and create jobs. And as Robert said, there is an opportunity with a tight labor market, even though we have seen this before. And I also see a little bit of an opportunity on the ESG world, right? The S has been notoriously difficult to measure, and but there is pressure there. And I think if we measure the right things, and we actually have a project trying to do this, then you can have at least companies focusing on the right things. And I will end with one example, right? If we know that a problem is the stepping stone jobs, that they're decreasing, stepping stone jobs are not invented by, a labor department classification. It is a job becomes a stepping stone job because it facilitates a transition, right? It's what administrator assistants used to be. People hire from a pool of workers from the retail, from food, and then they enter into a company and then given a chance to become, white collar work and move up in an organization. IT analysts, HR associates, like any of these jobs that exist today and are going to grow, they can become stepping stones if we hire, as Robert says, maybe without a BA, are willing to take that risk, learn by doing, and then help them move to the next thing. And some of that movement, as the example you gave, is not going to be within the company. Because at Walmart or at Starbucks, there's one supervisor for 100 baristas. But companies are realizing that mobility is also helping them launch to the next thing. And I think those who do are seeing retention. My last point there is if we were able to actually account for the value of that retention better than we do today, loyalty more so in these times, we would be willing to make more of those investments than now when we look at labor as simply as an expense.
Thank you, Marcela. I have the unfortunate task of having to close this panel. I can't thank you all enough for your insights and your wisdom and from connecting from all over the world. I leave this with optimism, a combination of perhaps remote work, digital upskilling, companies doing their job in being more intentional about equity and about worker mobility might start to solve the problem of the labor market that we have today. So thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.